Lena stood still inside the cold cell of Drello's 9, where the walls hummed softly with the power of distant machines, and the metallic floor chilled her bare feet with each step. But she did not move much. She did not speak either. She simply waited. And listened and watched, because that was what she had learned back on Earth. To survive, first you observe, and then you act, not with noise or chaos, but with purpose and with care. The Valari guards outside her cell were tall and covered in sleek gray armor with glowing red visors, and every time they passed, they would pause to sneer at her through the barrier, as if she were nothing more than a weak animal to them. She was soft-skinned, thin frame, short height, nothing like their battle-forged bodies. One of the guards once leaned in close and laughed a sharp laugh that echoed off the steel walls, and said something in his guttural tongue, but then translated for her sake, or perhaps for his own amusement, and he said that human skin looked like wet paper, and that he would tear it off to see if she had bones at all, and then he walked away, still laughing with the others, and Lena simply stood there with her hands behind her back and her eyes half closed, like she was resting, though her ears heard everything, and her mind recorded every step they took, every gap in their patrols, and every flicker in the lights above. Other prisoners in nearby cells were different species from different corners of the galaxy, some with scales, some with feathers, some with glowing eyes, and many had already given up. They sat slumped in silence or whimpered in corners, their hope drained like water through rusted pipes. But Lena did not slump, and she did not whimper, and that made them watch her with quiet curiosity, because she was so very still, like a blade not yet unsheathed. In the far corner of her cell, there was a crack in the wall, a small fracture where something sharp glinted in the flickering light, and she had noticed it on her first night, but she did not touch it, not yet. Instead, she waited until the third cycle, when the power grid stuttered for half a second, and she knew the systems were not as perfect as the Valari believed. Then she moved fast as a whisper, her fingers wrapping around the metal sliver and pulling it free. It was jagged and rusted, but it had an edge, and to Lena that meant one thing: it could be a weapon. Her thoughts drifted for a moment, not to fear or panic, but to home, to Earth as it had been. The ruined cities, the broken towers, the sky always heavy with ash and wind, and how people had lived not with comfort, but with instinct and edge. Her father had taught her how to cut meat with a bone shard. Her mother had shown her how to bind wounds with scraps of old cloth. They had lived not because they were strong in the way the Valari believed, but because they had endured and endured and endured until strength was no longer needed, because they had become something harder than bone. The door hissed open suddenly, and one of the guards stepped in, tall and confident. His name was something she did not care to remember, and he held a staff that buzzed with electricity, and he motioned for her to stand. She was already standing, so she did not move. He stepped closer and said something about showing the other prisoners what happened to the soft ones, and he raised his hand and struck her hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed, and several aliens flinched in their cells, but Lena did not fall. She turned her head slowly back to him, her expression empty and calm, and her hand tightened around the shard hidden behind her back. The guard laughed again, clearly disappointed that she did not scream or cry, and he leaned in close to say another insult, but this time she moved. She stepped into him fast and quiet, her hand flashing upward, the shard cutting a clean line across his throat, not deep enough to kill, but enough to silence him instantly. He gasped, stumbling back, clutching at his bleeding neck as the red shimmered across his armor, and Lena stepped back into the center of the cell, standing tall and still with the bloodied shard in her hand. The other guards outside shouted alarms, and the barrier flickered to life, stronger now, but no one rushed in immediately, and for a moment everything was quiet again, except for the sound of the wounded Valari choking on his pride as he crawled backward out of the cell, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. She said nothing to him, only watched him go, then dropped the shard into her sleeve and turned to sit on the floor with her legs crossed and her hands resting on her knees. One of the younger captives in the next cell, a small creature with Orange skin and wide blue eyes stared at her with something close to awe, and whispered a question asking if she was not afraid of what they would do to her now. But Lena looked at the child, and then at the blood still smeared across the floor, and said very softly that they were the ones who should be afraid now, because they had mistaken quiet for weakness and softness for surrender, and because she had not yet begun. The lights above flickered again, and the machines hummed louder, and footsteps rushed down the corridor. But Lena did not move. She had made her first cut, not just on the Villari, but into the illusion they held, the illusion that humans were fragile, the illusion that softness was something to mock. She had carved the truth into flesh and bone, and she knew this was only the beginning. The air in the holding block had changed after that moment, when Lena had drawn blood from the Villari. The wall still hummed the same, the lights still flickered with their weak pulse, and the smell of cold metal still lingered. But now something new had settled into the space, something that moved quietly through the silence. It was the presence of fear, not her fear, but theirs. The guards had not spoken to her directly since the incident. Instead, they sent drones to monitor her cell. Their boots no longer paused at her door for amusement. They passed quickly, now pretending not to look, but always watching, and even the other prisoners who once stared with hollow eyes now looked at her differently, not with hope, but with a strange mixture of curiosity and caution. Lena sat near the wall, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees, and her mind always thinking. Her eyes scanned the ceiling, the corners, the flow of the guards in the hallway, the timing of the drones, the way the shadows stretched when the lights blinked twice in a row. Every detail mattered because the first strike had only opened a crack. The rest of the truth still had to be carved through. She had hidden the metal shard again, this time behind the loose grate near the drain under her sleeping slab. It was not the perfect weapon, but it had served its purpose. It had made a statement, and now her eyes searched for something better, something that could do more than cut, something that could end. Across from her cell was a younger prisoner, a creature from a forest moon, known for their agility and speed. His skin was patterned with light and dark lines, and his eyes were wide with quiet respect. He had seen what she had done, and after a full cycle of silence, he finally spoke in a whisper, barely louder than breath. He asked how a human could be so calm after drawing blood from one of the Villari. Lena looked at him for a long moment, and then answered without emotion. She told him that where she came from, silence was not fear, it was focus, and calm was not weakness, it was control. And when he asked if she planned to do it again, she gave no answer, only returned her gaze to the shadows. That same day during the ration delivery, a small glitch in the force field made the tray bounce off the floor, and a small shard of clear plastic cracked off and slid near her foot. It looked harmless, just a piece of food tray, but her eyes lit up, not with excitement, but recognition. She picked it up with care, feeling its edge with her thumb, and nodded slightly. It could be sharpened. Lena used the wall again, scraping the plastic piece slowly and carefully. At night, when no eyes watched, or when the lights dimmed in the rest cycle, she shaped it into a pointed edge, rough but workable. And then she did the same with another piece, and then another. She hid them in her clothing, in small folds under seams, behind panels. Her collection was slow but steady, and each one was a promise. Her thoughts often drifted back to Earth, not because of longing, but because of memory. Training, survival, harsh seasons, empty cities, predators that moved on two legs and four, and the lessons that softness was never a flaw unless you let it remain untested. Her people had learned long ago how to survive, not because they had weapons, but because they had nothing else. They had turned bone into blades and sorrow into strength. On the fourth cycle after the first cut, the Villari brought in a new prisoner, a young alien child with bruises on his face and fear in his eyes. The guards tossed him into the adjacent cell and laughed as he fell to the ground. They called him useless and said he would not last long. Lena watched without speaking, and when the child curled into a corner trembling, she turned away, not out of indifference, but out of understanding. She knew that look. She had worn it Herself once, that night the child whimpered in his sleep, loud enough to echo across the walls, and a passing guard stopped sneering through the barrier and activated the force shock to silence him. It hit the child hard enough to knock him out of his sleep, his thin frame shaking on the floor. The guard laughed and moved on, but Lena stood silently at her wall, her eyes locked onto the motion of his back and the timing of his steps. The next day, when the same guard returned, he found her standing near the door, her face calm and her body relaxed, and he smirked, calling her the soft one again, and said maybe she had gone silent because she finally accepted her place. He stepped closer to taunt her more. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he wanted to remind himself that humans were weak. Either way, he leaned in too close, and that was his mistake. Her hand shot forward, the plastic blade pressed into the soft gap between his armor and neck, not enough to kill, but deep enough to make him scream. She pulled back quick, leaving him stumbling away, bleeding and howling. The alarm rang louder this time, but again, no one entered her cell. She backed into the center, calm as ever. The child in the next cell stared with wide eyes as she sat down again, and this time she looked back at him and said quietly that softness was not something to laugh at, it was something to fear, because it learned faster, it adapted deeper, and when it rose with purpose. The other prisoners started whispering more now, stories of the human who bled the Valari, twice the one who made blades from scraps, the one who did not break. The guards spoke less and watched more. Drones hovered longer than before, and Lena simply kept building her tools, preparing for what she knew was coming. She was not here to escape, not yet. She was here to teach, and each blade she carved and each drop of blood she spilled was a lesson for them, a lesson they would learn whether they wanted to or not. News moved like shadow across the compound, whispers spreading from cell to cell, and word of the human girl who drew blood twice reached corners. Even the guards thought were silent. Some prisoners began to sit straighter, some looked to the hallway longer than before, and a few began to sharpen things of their own using stone or bone or scrap. Even the youngest among them seemed to breathe differently, like the air itself had shifted, and Lena remained at the center of it all, quiet, watchful, never loud, never boasting, simply present, like a storm waiting to rise. Valari High Guard had taken notice too. Their reports were filled with confusion. How could a human of no armor, no strength, no weapons, harm two trained officers in their own facility? Their pride could not allow such a scar to remain, and so they set another. Not just a guard, but a punisher, one of their enforcers, bred and built for combat, larger than the rest, covered in heavier plating, taller than any other, with arms that could snap steel, and a voice that shook the walls when he walked. His name was never spoken, because his presence alone was enough. He arrived at her cell with a crowd of guards watching from behind force fields and energy barriers, and without ceremony the door opened, and he stepped inside while others observed from a safe distance. Lena stood calmly, her hands empty, her eyes steady, and when the enforcer entered, he smiled in the way Valari did not. With kindness, but with the certainty of victory. He raised his voice and called her weak again, soft again, and promised that her story would end today. Lena did not speak. She only stepped back 2 paces and drew a line on the floor with the toe of her foot, then another line crossing it, and then one more, forming a symbol. Her hands moved slow and graceful, like she was tracing memory, not making a threat, and the enforcer laughed, asking if she thought drawing on the floor would save her, but she continued anyway, each line forming the same mark that had once been carved into walls back on Earth. A mark of focus, a mark of preparation, a mark before war. He charged forward, expecting her to freeze, but Lena sidestepped, barely moving, and let his massive arm pass her shoulder. She moved with silence, pressed her palm against the edge of his elbow and twisted just enough to unbalance him. He stumbled forward and growled, not in pain but in frustration, and swung again and again, but each time she moved like wind weaving through stone, letting his force waste itself on empty air. Then she struck, not with fists, not with blade, but with speed. Her Hand gripped the handle of a sharpened fragment from her sleeve, and she plunged it into the soft joint behind his shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but sharp enough to make him scream. He twisted and slammed her against the wall, but she absorbed the hit, rolled down and came up again, already moving her other blade, found the back of his knee slicing through the thin membrane there, and he buckled, roaring with rage. Prisoners in nearby cells gripped their bars, some whispering prayers, some just watching wide-eyed, and the guards outside moved forward to stop it, but the officer in charge held them back, curious if the enforcer could finish what he started. Lena stepped back as the giant tried to rise, blood dripping down his leg, his breath heavier. Now his strikes slower. He shouted that she was just flesh and bone, but she answered for the first time, not with a whisper, but a single word, no. She dashed forward one last time and struck the center of his chest with the hilt of her blade. Not to pierce, but to knock the wind from him, and as he fell backward onto one knee, she stepped beside him, placed the edge of her blade near his throat, and held it there, not cutting, not yet, just showing that she could, and in that moment the entire compound seemed to hold its breath. She leaned close and said softly that softness was the beginning of all things, but it was also the end, because it knew how to shape itself. It knew how to bend without breaking, and when it hardened it remembered everything, and never forgot. The blade left a shallow mark across the side of his neck, not fatal, but permanent. Then she stepped away and let him fall. The silence broke only when the guards rushed forward, dragging the enforcer out, his blood leaving a trail behind them, and still Lena stood there, untouched, unmoved, simply watching, until the door closed again and the force field returned, and she sat back in the center of her cell, like nothing had happened. That night the prisoners did not sleep. They spoke in low voices, stories now growing louder of the human who danced with giants, who carved warriors, who did not speak unless needed. They began to ask her for words, for guidance, and some even knelt as she passed during the short moments of group movement. But Lena gave no orders. She only observed each day gathering more scraps, more blades, more maps in her head, because the fight was not done. This was only the second lesson. The third would be louder. The next morning, a younger prisoner who had once ignored her now slid a piece of sharpened pipe across the hall to her through a crack under the wall. It was small but useful, and Lena accepted it with a nod, the silent kind that meant respect, and the child who had once been struck now smiled from his corner, sitting taller, now stronger, because she had given him reason to stand. Lena cleaned the blood from her hands, not with disgust but with care, because each drop told a story, and every mark she made on their kind was a warning, not shouted, not screamed, but carved clean and deep. She did not fight for sport. She did not strike for rage. She fought because they had called her soft, and she had shown them what softness could become when shaped by fire and time. The Lari facility no longer breathed with the same pride that once echoed through its steel corridors. The walls still held their strength, and the machines still hummed, but something beneath the surface had shifted, and that shift was spreading like a silent fire. Each day now carried an edge, a tension that tightened the air, like a stretched wire ready to snap. The guards no longer laughed during patrols, their steps faster, their weapons always ready, and though they said nothing, their eyes betrayed unease. Lena remained still within her cell, but the quiet around her was no longer isolation. It had become command. The prisoners now moved when she moved, watched where she watched, and waited for her signs. Even if they did not fully understand her, they knew she was the reason the Valari walked differently, now the reason. Fear had returned to the ones who once ruled without question. She had taught them in silence, shown them that strength was not just height or muscle. It was patience, timing, precision. It was the way she moved without waste, the way she acted only when needed, and each strike was not just a wound, it was a lesson, and now the lessons had spread. Some of the older prisoners who had spent years bent under the weight of Valari cruelty now stood straight. They whispered to others, passing scraps of sharp metal through the drainage grates and service tunnels. They mapped guard routines in their minds and memorized which guards flinched when they saw her, and which ones avoided her cell entirely. The rebellion had no name, no flag, no orders. Just the slow, steady rise of courage, sparked by one quiet girl with sharp hands and a sharper mind. Valari could feel it. They brought new guards from other sectors. Men of thicker armor and tighter orders. They tried to isolate the prisoners, keep them from exchanging words, but words found ways to travel, carved into walls, scratched under bunks, whispered across hallways. At night one day they sent in someone different, not a soldier, but a speaker, one of their high commanders known not for battle but for bending minds with words. He entered her cell alone with hands raised and voice calm, saying he came not with threats but with reason. He spoke in slow tones, telling her that humans were not meant for this, that softness was beauty, and beauty did not belong in war. He offered better treatment, promised safety in exchange for calm. Lena said nothing, her eyes held steady, and her breath even. He tried again, this time shifting tone, calling her special, saying she had a gift, and it would be wasted if she led others into death. But still she said nothing. He waited, then asked if she truly thought she could change the outcome here, that her blades would matter when the Valari had ships orbiting above and forces ready to crush rebellion with a command. She looked at him for a long moment, then stepped forward and held out her hand, palm open, not with a weapon, but with a strip of cloth, old, torn, frayed at the ends, and stained with blood and dust and oil, and she placed it gently on the floor between them and stepped back. He asked what it meant. She said one word: legacy. The commander scoffed and turned away, leaving without another word, but his pace was quicker, and his eyes darker, because even without weapons, her silence had spoken louder than his speeches. That night the lights flickered longer than usual, and a soft pulse in the walls signaled a power test, something Lena had noticed happening every 8 cycles, and she knew the moment was close. She walked to the far corner of her cell, removed the sharpened metal she had shaped over weeks, and held it in her palm, then crouched near the floor and began drawing again. Not symbols this time, but a map she had memorized, every hallway, every guard change, every blind spot, and she marked them carefully, then rolled the cloth tight and slipped it through the narrow crack to the cell beside hers, where the forest-skinned prisoner waited. He took it with wide eyes and nodded once, understanding that this was no longer about blades or blood. This was the signal. When the lights dimmed, the prisoners began to move, not loudly, not in panic, but with purpose. They passed signals with their hands, tapped patterns against walls, and prepared tools hidden in shadows, and when the lights dimmed again for the final time, they struck. Lena was the first to move. Her cell door opened during the grid flicker, and she stepped into the hall without hesitation. One guard saw her and raised his weapon, but she was already there, striking low and fast, blade sinking into his thigh, then another movement clean across his shoulder. Before he could scream, he was down, and she kept moving. The halls filled with sound, not chaos, but rhythm, boots slamming, fists landing, voices rising, not in fear, but in strength. Prisoners overwhelming guards with numbers, and fire stolen from the very walls they were kept in. And every time Lena passed through, she led not from behind, but at the front, cutting through fear, like she had once cut through silence. The rebellion burned through the block like a rising tide, and guards fell back, calling for support, but the systems were already failing. Power shorting circuits, cracking locks opening across the sector, and those who had once been called weak now ran free, weapons in hand and eyes filled with something the Valari had never expected. In the center of it all stood Lena, her clothes torn, her arms marked with blood and sweat and dust, but her grip steady and her eyes brighter than ever. She faced a group of guards who had circled the exit, weapons drawn, voices shaking, telling her to stand down, but she took one step forward and they stepped back. One of the prisoners turned to her and said with awe in his voice that she had become more than legend, she had become fire. And she looked back and said no, just truth. Behind her the compound continued to fall, as one by one the lies of Valari's strength cracked under the weight of sharpened memory. The Fire had reached every corner of the prison. Now the walls that once held screams now echoed with footsteps of. The free alarms flashed across every surface, but no one ran from them. Anymore, no one bowed their head. The force fields had fallen, and the control panels, sparked with broken circuits, weapons once held by the guards, now passed from hand to hand. As prisoners armed themselves not with hope, but with purpose, their voices no longer whispered, their faces no longer bent under fear, and in the center of that storm walked Lena with her blades in hand and silence on her lips. The air was filled with smoke from broken vents and power cores that had cracked under the weight of rebellion, and the scent of melted metal mixed with the raw sting of blood, sweat, and dust. Still Lena moved with calm, as if she had expected all this, and perhaps she remembered every step, every corridor, every exit point, and now she was leading the others toward the hangar where the ships waited, some half buried in ash, others still glowing under the dim emergency lights. But it was not the ships she cared for, not yet, because one final task still remained. High officer of the Valari base had not run. He waited instead at the command tower, at the heart of the complex, where the walls were stronger and the guards more loyal, and his voice still carried weight through the intercoms, warning prisoners that their rebellion would not last, reminding them that humans were not made for power, that softness would always crumble before fire. But his words fell empty now, as the footsteps of the uprising rose louder. Lena reached the gates of the tower without hesitation. 2 guards stood waiting, armored heavier than the others, and armed with electric spears that crackled as they moved toward her. But she did not stop. She ran forward, low to the ground, blades at her sides, and as the first guard thrust forward, she shifted to the left, letting the spear pass close enough to feel the heat. Then she brought her weapon upward across his ribs, not deep, but sharp enough to make him fall. She turned and ducked under the second swing, her foot sliding across the floor as she struck behind the knee and brought him down. The doors to the command center hissed open slowly, a last defense, and inside stood the Valari officer, tall, unmoving, dressed in the deep black of leadership, his hands behind his back, and his face calm as he watched her approach. He said she had done well, more than expected, and asked if she came for revenge, but Lena said nothing. She stepped into the room and let the door close behind her. Just the 2 of them now, and no more voices, no more crowds, only silence and truth. He reached for his weapon, slowly, a curved blade, shaped from molten ore and glowing at the edges, and she nodded as if approving the choice, not for honor but for closure. He charged first, his movements precise, practiced, elegant, like all Valari fighters trained from birth. But Lena did not meet him with speed. She waited, counted his steps, watched his shoulders, and when the strike came, she moved not away, but into it, sliding beside his arm and cutting along the inside with a slice so clean it left no sound. Hissed and turned, swinging again, faster now, but Lena flowed under it, her second blade rising to meet the soft gap at his side, pressing just enough to stop his breath before pulling back and letting him stumble. His blade clattered against the floor, and she stepped forward, kicked it away, and stood above him, not with fury, but stillness. The officer stared up at her, asking if this was her victory, if blood was what she came for, and she shook her head, slowly saying that victory was not found in the fall of one man, but in the rise of those who refused to kneel. That truth was never given, it was carved and shown and earned with scars and silence. She turned him over, reached down and took his curved blade, then placed it gently on his chest, and with her other hand reached for the armor on his shoulder and began to carve. Not to kill, not to punish, but to mark, and the symbol she drew was simple, the same one she had traced on the floor before her first battle. The mark of those who endure, of those who break without noise and rise without sound. When she was done, she stood and said that the next time someone called her kind, soft, they would remember this. Then she walked away, leaving him there, not dead, not broken, just marked, and behind her, the others had already begun sealing the exit points, unlocking the hangar ships and powering Up controls, the rebellion had become escape and freedom, and a story that would move beyond these walls. Lena boarded the last ship with no words. Her body tired, her arms lined with bruises, her legs stiff from the weight of what she carried. But her eyes remained clear and sharp. The ship engines roared, and the prisoners, who were no longer prisoners, cheered as the sky opened above them, no longer a ceiling but a path. As the ship lifted higher, she looked back at the ground below the compound. Now crumbling, the tower still standing but empty, the officers watching from windows, no longer speaking, only staring at the smoke rising from their pride. And then she turned her face to the stars, not with a smile but with stillness. She did not want to be remembered as a hero, nor as a symbol. She only wanted the truth known, that humans were never soft, not in the way they thought, and that softness, when tested, became something sharper than any blade and harder than any stone, and that when the time came to fight, it was not noise that won, but silence. Stars grew wider around her, and the ship carried them away into the dark and quiet of space, and in the wake of their passing, they left only memory and blood and bone, and on those bones was carved the truth, the end.